No detour from Calvary. Luke 2, 6-7 says, "And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and unwrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn." You would think that if God could so rule the world as to use an empire-wide census to bring Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem like we looked at yesterday, he surely could have seen to it that there was room in the inn. He could have. Absolutely. And Jesus could have been born in a wealthy family. He could have turned stone into bread in the wilderness. He could have called 10,000 angels to be at his aid in Gethsemane. He could have come down from the cross and saved himself. But the question is not what God could do, but what he willed to do. God's will was that though Christ was rich, yet for your sake became poor. The no vacancy signs over the motels in Bethlehem were for your sake. For your sake he became poor. 2 Corinthians 8:9. God rules all things, even hotel capacities and available Airbnbs, for the sake of his children. And Calvary Road was no different. It begins with the no vacancy sign in Bethlehem and ends with the spitting and scoffing of the cross in Jerusalem. And we must not forget that Jesus said in Luke 9:23, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross." We join him on Calvary Road, and we hear him say, "Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you." John 15:20. To the one who calls out enthusiastically, "I will follow you wherever you go," Jesus responds, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Luke 9:57-58. So yes, God could have seen to it that Jesus had a room for his birth. But that would have been a detour off Calvary Road. Because in Hebrews 12 it tells us that Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith, which we all quote and we know, but the next initial line is, "For the joy laid before him, he took the cross." For the joy laid before him, he took the cross. And that's contradictory in terms in human mindset. There is no joy in the cross. You do any research on the Roman crucifixion, science and history would tell you grim stories. We understand what Jesus went through. And Jesus went beyond that. He was beaten beforehand to the point of not being recognizable. And then he suffered the most painful and anguished death. And I've often said that the humility of Christ's birth acts as a foundation of his humility on the cross. He came as a humble child of humble parents, humble origins. The very fact that Mary and Joseph had to offer a dove for the sacrifice when they go to the temple kind of intimates culturally that they weren't well off. They didn't provide a lamb. They didn't provide a more expensive animal to do because they couldn't. And so they were just humble people. And Christ came that way for our sake. He didn't want the glam. He just came and lived his life, and that life echoed. The nature of his life echoed as he hung on that cross. So he didn't detour an inch. He understood what it was to have nothing. And even in his ministry, he had nowhere to rest his head. He served constantly over his 3.5 year ministry before going to the cross. Not to give any false idea or false hope, but to know what it was like to follow God. But also, as it says in Hebrews, the joy that was laid before him. That's why he did it. For the joy of pleasing his Father. For the joy of saving many people from the clutches of the enemy. From saving people that he would call his bride. For obeying his Father's will. That was the joy. His joy was shifted, not from earthly things, but for kingdom-minded things. And that brought him great joy, which allowed him and steered him and prepared him for the worst that was going to happen in his life, which was to suffer and die on that cross. But he did so for great joy, because he knew the result. He knew that he would not lose. He knew that he would have the victory. He knew that at the end of it he would have a bride. And he knew at the end of it he would have demonstrated his Father's love and mercy for his people, and that he would have brought praise to God's glorious grace.